I'm now joined by Allan Ngari, the senior researcher in the Transnational Threats and International Crime Program at the Institute for Security Studies. Very good evening to Mr. Ngari. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you.
First of all, who is AlShabaab and what drives them? What's their modus operandi and what's their agenda?
Yeah, so AlShabaab is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. You will recall that Al-Qaeda was the largest of the violent extremist groups towards the late 1990s, early 2000s. And there was an offshoot, splinter groups, as in most of the violent extremist groups actually do go through some form of metamorphosis, and that is what happened in Al-Qaeda. And Al-Shabaab was birthed, of course, in Somalia, is housed in Somalia, and they've been operating mostly in the Greater Horn and east of Africa.
I mean, author on terrorism Stig Jarle Hansen portrays Al-Shabaab as a hybrid Islamist organization that combines a strong streak of Somali nationalism coupled with a bit of international jihadism. Could this be as a result? I mean, the fact that they attacked some of the Somalian officials attending meetings in a Nairobi hotel, could this be an extension of that attack on Somalia?
Well, we have to understand the modus operandi of Al-Shabaab. They have historically said that they would like to govern the country according to their own interpretation of their holy text. And so any forces, Somali or otherwise, that would go contravene that philosophy would obviously be a target. We have seen in the past that a lot of the targets have mostly been the East African countries that have contributed to the African Union's Somali mission, AMISOM. And Al-Shabaab was very clear that there would be reprisal for these countries. So Kenya, being the immediate neighbor, with a strong defense force like other East African countries, has over the past few years been a target of Al-Shabaab. And so this did not come as a surprise in the sense that it has always been within the strategy of Al-Shabaab to do so. But I think what is most important is the response of states to the acts of violent extremist groups such as Al-Shabaab. And I think today we have seen the demonstration of the Kenyan intelligence and security forces to work in a coordinated fashion. You'll recall in 2013, following the Westgate Mall attack, it wasn't as coordinated as we are seeing now. We are seeing the Reese squad, which is the elite force of the Kenyan Defense Force, coming in quite quickly, together the firefighters. So it was quite a coordinated, well-coordinated response from the Kenyan government.
Yeah. And do they have any links with other jihadist groups like Nigeria's Boko Haram and the Islamic State, for instance? And if so, would that would that augment their hold on the continent?
So you will recall that Daesh was trying to champion ISIS, ISIL, whatever name it goes by, was trying to champion an Islamic caliphate, and that it would have different versions of it in different parts of the world. So other than the allegiances that we have seen by certain violent extremist groups such as Boko Haram, for example, which pledged allegiance to Daesh, there isn't really an immediate connection between all the violent extremist groups. But we can see from the attacks that they do have in different parts of the world that the modus operandi is the same. It's to instill fear in the civilian population while at the same time propagating its false narrative of an Islamic caliphate that they would like to rule the world.
And what are some of the challenges that perhaps the international community faces in dealing with this scourge?
Well, over the past few years, and since the United Nations came up with a global counterterrorism strategy, we have seen the international community handling as many of the attacks and conditions that are conducive to the spread of terrorism over the years. And the global counterterrorism strategy is an excellent document that allows not just the international community at the international level, but also regionally, requesting and asking states, regional entities such as the African Union, sub-regional entities such as ECOWAS in West Africa, to come up with strategies, and here in Southern Africa, SADC, to come up with strategies to try and address and combat terrorism. So we have seen quite some responses. They are effective. We advocate for a criminal justice response to terrorism, but as you can see from today's attack in Nairobi, it is necessary to also have a military response, and hopefully then we will be able to see the criminal justice system kicking in then to provide fair trials for suspects of terrorism offenses.
And the fact that terrorism takes many and different forms and is also perpetrated by both the state and the non-state actors makes it more difficult to defeat it. Just how safe are we?
It's quite controversial when we talk about state-sponsored terrorism, and many states have tried to venture away from that. And I will not venture into speculating the reasons as to why states do so. But for non-state actors, obviously being the violent extremist groups that we know of in East Africa, AlShabaab being the biggest of them, their motivations are really, as I started by saying, it's to control and to ensure that they actually have effective control of territory, but at the same time to propagate their propaganda, which is to rule in accordance to their interpretation of their holy statutes.
Do you know for sure who funds them?
There's evidence that has emerged from research that various violent extremist groups get funding from various sources. There's a connection to organized crime, so wildlife poaching, but there have also been quite interesting sources of avenue for funding. So AlShabaab, for example, has been exploiting charcoal trade in East Africa, sugar, cattle importation and exportation, but also in their quest to control territory, they have forced communities to pay some form of taxes.
So in what capacity do they carry out the trade? Do they perhaps carry out the trade under a certain veil, or just as AlShabaab, for instance?
As AlShabaab, they control the territory, and they are able then to carry out business in terms of goods and services like any other entity, and that is how they've been operating. And this is what many...
Why then is it difficult to deal with them if they are known?
Well, it is known, and that is why we have missions such as AMISOM that are trying to infiltrate and curb these activities. And there has been levels of success. We know that closer to the border to Kenya, there have been several attempts to ensure that trade happens across the boundaries, across the Kenya-Somali boundary, but there has been quite some success in trying to prevent that from happening. So there are very successful efforts to prevent the funding of terrorism organizations. But it's an ongoing process. The international community is also a party to this in terms of capacity building, of national criminal justice systems, border control, immigration, and quite a whole host of actors that are involved in trying to stem the problem of terrorism, not just in East Africa, but in most parts of Africa, West Africa particularly.
And it's quite interesting that most African governments do have greater capacity to fight terrorism. They have greater military precision and greater budgets to fight these insurgents. But apparently they're still failing. Why is that?
Well, we have to understand that first there has been a shift in global priorities, and the reason why there is a lot of resources that are being dedicated not just by African states but the international community as a whole is because of the very grave threat that terrorism poses to society as it is. And yes, a lot of these resources are being used, and I would not say that they're not successful. There is a lot of successes that have been registered over the years. What we are propagating and what we are trying to advise states is to employ a multi-pronged approach. So a military response on its own is not sufficient. There's got to be a plethora of avenues. So as I mentioned, a criminal justice response is also necessary. So all these are stated within international communities agreements, the UN Global counterterrorism strategy that I mentioned, but also the international community has different platforms that have been set up. The Global Counterterrorism Forum, for example, that comes up with recommendations for states on how to address the issue of terrorism and violent extremism. So we are making a lot of efforts towards addressing this issue. We are so much better than we were 20 years ago when we first saw these attacks. Nairobi is not, this is not just the first attack that's happened. We'll go back to 98 when the US bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam happened. And the responses then compared to now have fundamentally changed. And it's as a result of all this concerted effort to address violent extremism.
What are some of the soft targets? Well, I know it can be a bit controversial saying that some of the countries are soft targets, but what are some of them? Some has been saying that Kenya is actually one of the soft targets for Al-Shabaab, given the frequency at which they operate in that country. And there's also been, at some point, fears and concerns that there could be some bit of a terrorism or terrorist here in South Africa. We had an analyst earlier on saying that they operate at a largely Islamic area in Johannesburg where they carry out their trade. Just how far, I mean, rather, how safe are South Africans at this point?
Oh, many questions in one, but I will try and take them bit by bit. Al-Shabaab's attack to Kenya and Uganda in 2010, the Kampala 2010 bombings. These attacks, as according to Al-Shabaab, and they took responsibility for these attacks, is as a result of the contribution of the defense forces to the AMISOM force that is fighting Al-Shabaab. So their reprisal attacks. And so Al-Shabaab has been clear that they will continue with their reprisal attacks to any contributing force to AMISOM. And we can see that AMISOM itself is also developing various strategies and to address this particular issue. Now, coming down to Southern Africa, as I said, that we have within this region a counterterrorism strategy, and we also have the different states that have different agencies that are dealing specifically with the threat of terrorism. In South Africa, the intelligence agencies as well as security forces are well coordinated, very well coordinated, I must say, and we are seeing, as you're very well aware, we have the criminal justice system fully activated with investigations and prosecution of terrorism offenses. So I think that we shouldn't think that South Africa cannot be a target, but at present I believe that efforts have been taken to secure the country, and it would be out of context to say that South Africa is a target for terrorist activities, but also not to be oblivious to the fact that any city in the world can be a target, a soft target for that matter.
And the jihadist recruitment mechanisms, is it safe to say that some of them could be driven by taking advantage of some of the civilians' state of, their economic state? Some have been driven, some are highly impoverished and they've been offered jobs and, some other perks by these jihadists. Just how easy it is to indoctrinate and perhaps recruit the youths in particular to join these Islamist groups?
So we talk about push and pull factors, reasons why individuals would be susceptible or vulnerable to joining violent extremist groups. And we have to note that these violent extremist groups are very smart. They really do want to take advantage of these vulnerable communities, and they prey on these vulnerabilities. Of course, a lot of the communities that are marginalized, we have seen in East and West Africa, communities that have been left out of the control of state resources, education, health, and various other facilities that should be availed to them by the state, have been preyed on by violent extremist groups. And the young people particularly have been recruited then into violent extremist groups. But I must say that the evidence that we are now receiving from returnees or people that, young people, for example, who join violent extremist groups on the basis of these push and pull factors, coming back with a totally different story that when they were in the violent extremist groups, they were completely disenfranchised. They did not receive that which they thought they would receive. So from a pull factor, the ideological factor, embracing a certain philosophy, they were not received in the same way. So they feel completely disenfranchised, as I said, and it's not necessarily what it appears to be. It's not as rosy as it is within the violent extremist groups.
Mr. Ngari, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your